Okay, thanks very much. Can you hear me okay? Just put a thumbs up. Is that good? Okay. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to be talking about the design of this undergrad class. And let me get straight into it here. So I'll start out by, I'm going to talk for about, hopefully, no more than 25 minutes, and then allow time for these breakout rooms, report back, and discussion, okay? And so what I'm going to start out by talking about is our predicament vis-a-vis the climate crisis, and then what I think is the theory of change, or at least the theory of change I believe in, how are we going to get ourselves out of this. And that's a sort of prelude to then setting up how the class is designed. So I'm going to sort of go through this first part and then talk more about the design of the class. So our predicament, as you doubtless all know, is we have a climate crisis. It's not just global warming or climate change, it's a crisis, it's an emergency. We're running out of time to deal with this. And this illustrates it in that this is the temperature map for 2019, the mean temperature for 2019 compared to the baseline of 1951 to 1980. This is just mind-boggling, okay? And by the way, 2020 is shaping up to be the hottest year perhaps ever recorded as well. So if you look, for example, at Southern Africa, where I'm originally from, or Western or Eastern Australia, you can see that we have about 4 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit increase since 1951 to 1980. There's just an enormous amount of energy being added to the atmosphere, about 4 Hiroshima bombs per second of every minute of every hour of every day for decades. And this, of course, is fueling the extreme weather events related to drought and fire and so forth. Now, any particular weather event is hard to attribute to climate change, but what climate change is doing is exacerbating the frequency and intensity of these events, right? And so we've all seen what's happened in Australia earlier this year, just astonishing. The drought and heat led to fires the size of European countries were burning. About 500 million animals perished, and millions of Australians were exposed to particulate matter that is probably going to inculcate health complications for the rest of their lives. It's very dramatic. Now, other aspects about how dramatic this is come from, what are the impacts of this temperature increase going to be, and what kinds of risks are we facing? And I think it's extremely instructive here not to take simply the word of climate scientists or leftist-inspired people, but to take the word of, large-scale corporations such as JP Morgan, who wrote a recent report called Risky Business, the Climate and the Macroeconomy, which they did not obviously want the public to see, but this was leaked. And I knew about this report a couple of months ago when it came out, but I didn't get around to reading it until a couple of days ago. It's simply astonishing. So for example, they have a figure in this report, JP Morgan Chase does, that show us the number of extreme weather events on the x-axis, on the y-axis here, and year on the x-axis. And what you see is around 1980, had about 200, 250 extreme weather events per year. And now in 2020, we have something like 800 or 900, which is something like 4 times as many. And it really looks as if it's going exponential. And in fact, we think we're on RCP 8.5. We are having exponential temperature increase now. Now, on the front page of this report are the summaries. This is from the bank, okay? Empirical estimates based on the variability of the climate in recent decades likely massively underestimate the effects. So they're saying the IPCC is inherently conservative, as we know. But look at this, we cannot rule out catastrophic outcomes where human life as we know it is threatened. Right? This is sober assessment from the bank. And just to put this as a by the way in some context, this is the same bank, JP Morgan Chase, which has financed the fossil fuel industry to the tune of $200 billion over the last 3 years. And Wells Fargo, Citi, and Bank of America are not far behind. Bank of America, by the way, is the main bank for UCSD. So UCSD's banking is through a bank that is financing the fossil fuel industry to the tune of about $100 billion over the last 3 years. So anyway, this is our predicament. We're facing truly grave consequences in the near term. This is not 2100, this is the next couple of decades, and to some extent it's already here. And you know this, right? So what's the solution? Well, we can look to the IPCC 2018 report, and this is the consensus of international climate scientists backed by the world's governments, right? The world governments have to sign off on this. And they say, well, we must reduce our emissions by 45% by 2030 to have any chance of sort of holding this thing within perhaps reasonable levels, although reasonable is 1.5 degrees, which is still 50 and even 100% intensification of extreme weather events. And for 45% by 2030 of 2010 levels, right? This is what we need to do. This is the solution. We need a very quick year-upon-year decrease of fossil fuel emissions. That's what needs to happen. Now, as you've mostly noticed, I'm sure, this is just not really happening, right? This is the increase of CO2, gigatons of CO2 per year, just going up and up and up. It's true some countries have made some headway, but it's clearly appropriate and correct to say that most political systems and institutions are simply incapable of really reducing emissions, okay? That's not just Trump and the United States, including the Europeans and so forth. So why is that the case? Why are we not getting real with this? Why are political institutions failing at this? And so this is not just denial. I don't think we can accuse European governments of being in the thrall of denial. And I think the reason is that the liberal democracies, and not just them, but the ones we live in, have a fundamental commitment to an ideology of growth, right? It's just, you know, if you have a commitment to this ideology, the climate crisis and doing serious emissions reductions is extremely inconvenient. Now, why do I say this? What evidence can I give for this idea? So let me just give you a few pointers. Number one, the case of Obama, okay? So Obama took office in 2009 where the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress, and he's increased the fossil fuel subsidies by 45%, okay? Look at Trudeau in Canada. On June 18th of 2019, he declared a climate emergency in Canada, and the following day approved $7 billion of taxpayers' money to fund the pipeline that would carry the tar sands oil to Vancouver, okay? The European Union, in February this year, this is after Greta Thunberg has lectured the parliament, after thousands of towns and cities in mainly Western Europe have declared climate emergencies, after green parties have won power and increased their power in mostly Western Europe, the members of European Parliament voted in a majority to approve $30 billion of gas pipeline infrastructure, locking Europe into burning fossil fuel for a generation or more. And most recently, in April, beloved Governor Newsom, so good on the pandemic and social progressive causes, here he is. His scientific panel just approved 24 new fracking permits in California this month. So this is why I say, you know, our current political and institutional framework is simply not dealing with this. Now, what's the solution if that's the case? The solution is we need collective action wherever we are. Now, I'll explain a bit more what I mean by that. But what does collective action look like? Well, we're in San Diego. This is the 8th biggest city in the US. We're in the University of California, which is the biggest employer in the 5th biggest economy effectively in the world. And ultimately, when we see local grassroots institutional level changes and engagement, we can be confident that this will percolate politically. Of course, it has to happen in concert all around the place, but we're not everywhere. We're here. We're in San Diego and we're in the UC system. So that's what needs to happen. We need collective action in the places we are. Now, what is collective action? Well, I think you all have an intuition about this, I'm sure. Historically, we can go back and look at the women's suffrage movement, the campaign for the 5-day work week, the 8-hour workday, gay rights, civil rights, anti-apartheid. I mean, many of these things are successful, right? And they were successful because people got together and did collective action. Power relinquishes nothing without demand. It's not as if governments and capitalists sit around and say, oh, you're making those demands, fine, we'll do it. We don't just give the vote to women. You don't just give rights to African Americans just because somebody says they want it. Take a concerted collective action struggle. What does it look like right now? You have forms of extra institutional collective action outside the institution itself. For example, this UCSD Green New Deal that Colleen mentioned, which is a group on campus that is an alliance of faculty, students, and staff that get together and plan and perform actions to push UCSD to get real about emissions reduction. And then you have within institutional forms of collective action, and I think she passed along the task force report to you. For example, we have this UCSD Academic Senate Task Force on Climate Crisis, and this is an attempt to sort of galvanize people within UCSD, faculty particularly, to start doing collective action to push the local institution. And there's a set of principles there. I don't want to read it all to you out, read the whole thing verbatim, but I just want to touch on a few interesting aspects here. This report talks about concrete actions for emissions reduction, and it says, it acknowledges climate justice. We must accept that it is the historical responsibility for individuals, entities, and institutions who have emitted the most to cut emissions first. We need to decarbonize. In other words, we need to reduce emissions from our campus in all these ways. We need to prepare all the students, all of the undergrads with knowledge and classes about climate crisis and climate justice. We need to reorient our research mission, and we want to promote these policies. Okay, so these are examples of what collective action looks like. Now, some of you You may ask yourselves, and you're thinking right now, what does collective action have to do with individual action, right? Some people are going to say, it's pointless doing anything as an individual. This is systems change. We need systems change. And I think that's incorrect. It's wrong to say it's pointless to do individual action. You're going to wait around for systems change. But it's also wrong to do it the other way around and say, this is all on me. This is all about me. I have to take all the responsibility on my shoulders to make my changes to my life. That's also wrong. I think the way this works is extremely well explained by Peter Kalmus, who's a climate scientist at Caltech and JPL in Pasadena. He says, Peter Kalmus says, he's also on Twitter, he's a good climate activist, you can follow him, Climate Human is his tag. There is no collective action without individuals choosing to contribute to it. There is no cultural shift without individuals leading the way. There is no bright line between systems change and individuals acting according to their principles, right? There is no bright line between systems change and individuals acting according to their principles. Now, if you doubt that this is true, let me give you an example. Here's the example of Greta Thunberg, okay? This is one young 16-year-old, at least last year, who was able to galvanize a climate movement, and through her own example, for example, her very serious commitment to emissions reductions and not flying at all, was able to galvanize a flying less movement throughout Europe. Now look here at this is the domestic flights in Germany, which is yellow. This is the largest economy in Europe. So domestic flights in Germany, since Greta Thunberg came on the scene, in about a 7-month period, decreased by over 13%. What is this? This is individual Germans acting out of principle, saying, I'm not going to take that flight. Me as an individual, I'm not going to take that flight. But of course, when people do that all together, and of course they're doing that not in isolation, they're doing it through a cultural pattern, you get a massive reduction of emissions. Of course, they have good public transportation in Germany, which we don't here, so that helps, okay, which is also part of it. So, so that is the predicament. That is the theory of change, that you can't sit around waiting for political systems. You have to do collective action where you are. And now I'm going to get into some issues about designing a class. So a few bits of more information. I'm going to turn to the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. It's a very good resource that sort of updates every 6 months or so what the adult American is thinking about this. And here is what it was in 2019. Estimated percentage of adults who think global warming is happening. Okay, we're comforted. 67%. It's not a lot, but it's pretty good. But that isn't really what we want to know, what percentage think it's happening. What we really want to know is what percentage think it's caused by humans. And unfortunately, that answer is 53%. So only 53% of American adults think we have anthropogenic global heating. And if you look at the breakdown, it's a sort of combo of sort of the modern liberal centers with higher education, or more educated people, Boston, New York, Philly, Seattle, SF. But it's also interestingly including sort of West Texas and the Gulf and Miami and you know, parts of the Midwest that have had enormous flooding. And by the way, a lot of California, not just the sort of enclaves of high socioeconomic, the Central Valley and the Inland Empire. So it's a combo of people experiencing extreme weather events and sort of the liberal tribalism and the views that come with that, as well as higher education. Now, this is astonishing that it's only 53%, because as we know, probably all of you know this already, there is a consensus of climate scientists at about the 97% level. This is the famous paper from about 2012. I'm sure it's more than 97% now, but they actually measured it. They went back to abstracts of papers. They interviewed scientists themselves. And so 97% of climate scientists agree that there's anthropogenic global heating. Now, the discrepancy between that 97% of experts and the 53% of belief in America is very well explained by a systematic campaign of denial and distortion that has been fostered by the fossil fuel industry since the 1970s and 80s onward. There are documents in an archive in San Francisco. You can all Google UCSF Fossil Fuel Archive, and you can retrieve memos from ExxonMobil saying that they're going to foster confusion about this. It's also the fact that the media, in many ways, has been a lackey as of politicians. Why do I say the media has been a lackey? Here is the map from 2019 showing the percent of estimated adults who hear about global warming in the media at least once a week, only 32%. Right, this is in an era with hurricanes washing against the coast, flooding in the Midwest, dramatic events, fire events. Of course, none of those, or few of them, can specifically be attributed to climate change, but that climate change is very much part of the conversation. But for most of the media, it's still not. So there's a real failure here. Okay, so this is some backstory. Now, what this did was led me to kind of come up with the following sort of scheme, and I think Colleen shared that article with you, but if she didn't, she can do it later. So there's a short article I wrote that sort of lays this out. And so here's the way I thought about it, and this is inspired by schemes others have done, like the Yale Climate Change Group, but I did it somewhat differently. So there's an adult population, say in the US. There's some proportion of them who deny anthropogenic global heating. We'll call that category 1, which we know from what I just showed you is about 47%, or yeah, something like that. And there's about 53% we saw who accept anthropogenic global heating. Now, of the people who accept anthropogenic global heating, not everyone goes the next step, which is to really accept the impacts. It's, you can believe, you can say, oh, okay, fine, there's a consensus of, I get it. All right, all those arguments I came up with why, it's the earth that was heating, or the clouds, or whatever, or there's been, cycles across history from thousands of years ago. Okay, fine, all right, I accept it. But those people don't necessarily accept that the impacts are serious enough to warrant our attention. So that's what we call impact denialism. And a number of the standard skeptics have now jumped to become impact denialists. And of course, that's a much more difficult thing to refute, because there should be a genuine debate about the impacts and how severe they're going to be, okay? So you have the denial of impacts, but then you have people who accept the impacts. And of those who accept the impacts, which is probably most of the people we know, certainly in a place like UCSD, there is a large proportion of those could be put in a category, and I don't mean to do this in a whole moralistic fashion, I just think this is the facts, that we could characterize as performing a small amount of action. And that kind of action is, they look at it, they acknowledge it, they follow stories on it, and they make some personal changes. If you're a professor or staff, you would use people put up solar panels on their roofs, and they have a plug-in hybrid and things like this. They might make some changes to diet. Then there's a small category of people which really constitutes the climate movement, which is looking at it, grieving, talking about it. I mean, if you haven't sobbed and cried about our predicament, then I don't think you've really looked at it. You make the personal changes. You advocate within your institution. You teach and research if you happen to be a professor. There's lots of other things you could do. You support grassroots advocacy, Sunrise 350, all these kinds of things that are going on. Very important and good actions in San Diego. San Diego is a hotbed of interesting climate action, by the way, for a number of reasons, not least because there are 2 amazing women that are pushing these grassroots groups. So this is sort of part 1, is how do you bolster the believers? How do you move the denialists into this camp of accepting the facts? And then how do you shift the many people who believe anthropogenic global heating and accept the impacts to move to action? And this is probably one of the more important questions on planet Earth right now, I would say, from certainly in the domain of social sciences. In fact, for all of us in the biosphere, the animals and plants and the whole system is basically relying on a near-term move of a lot of people to action. Okay, so it's a very important issue. Now, I want to flag a little bit down at the bottom here. My view is that there's actions you can do, but there's sort of another category of action that's probably needed, and that's the pressure elected officials and joint civil disobedience and this kind of more edgy kind of thing. Now, why is that important? It's important because we have to recognize, I think, that just a lot of people believing we have a problem and engaging in small-scale actions is actually not going to cut it. And the reason that I just showed you why, right? When you have Governor Newsom of California approving fracking in April 2020, and you have all the other examples I gave you, you recognize that the socio-political structure has fundamental impediments built into it to taking this seriously. And so there's going to have to be kind of stepping up and a challenge in a way to that system. So that's where this last part comes in. All right, so all of this has now set us up well to sort of briefly, for about a few minutes here, give you an outline of really what this class looks like. And this is the thematic design. And this is a design at large thing. This is, I suppose, and at least Colleen and Deborah thought this was a design issue. I suppose it is. Depends how you define design. And I've come up with a scheme, but I don't know if it's the best scheme. And part of what your exercise is to reflect on this.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Ellie Burgess. I'm actually a PhD student at Northwestern University. Thanks for having me. So in our small group, we talked about first, in terms of the course design, that psychological empowerment of the first few sessions to really build up people's awareness of what's going on, how it's actually working. We thought was very powerful. Then in terms of the second set of classes, which focused, it seemed, more on that step-by-step process of, hey, what do we need to do first and second, and then third, in terms of some individual actions, but a lot more on our collective action front. So we liked that sort of process, and that that was mostly what we talked about in our group.
Great. So group 3 now, Colleen, or what?
Yeah, group 3. If we had more time, then we could have a conversation. Okay, thank you, John.
So this is John from group 3. We mainly discussed, the comment that I would like to say is I really enjoyed this presentation more than I think any other ecological, I guess like a climate change kind of presentation. So it definitely had an impact on me. I was, it was very impactful, this presentation. I enjoyed the fact that it came from, like, it showed the realistic, damn. I was so confident during like the small breakout room. Now I'm just kind of big room,
Yeah.
I will say the way that the story was told in the actual presentation, I really enjoyed, because it told a story, which is, I think, it's a necessary thing to do while talking about a topic such, to this caliber, that does have those, like, I think, mystery, and like people are scared of it. So the storytelling aspect in which the presenter did present was awesome. It also really helped that it described the whole situation, coming from like a scientific point of view with the data, the stats, like a realistic portrayal of how these events have like happened, with people like sweeping it under the rug and like making other countries like do it, and then like I didn't even realize the political aspect of it from like the 80s and 90s, as you said, and then also the emotional aspect of it really got to me as well, because this is the first time that I've ever heard about someone talk about ecological griefing as kind of a main topic. I really appreciated that, because these kind of things are scary, and I think it reassures the viewer that you've done your research enough to say that this will make you sad, but we also would like to develop a way to process that sadness, like through this ecological grief that you're talking about. So I think, and I would also like to say, grief is something that a lot of people have experienced, which, I mean, I have also experienced it. People with life experience have. So if you talk about ecological grief, it kind of, in a way, it struck me in a different way that these talks have not struck me before, because it's a real feeling that I think pushes for change, for positive change. After you grieve something, you can move forward from it. So I think the way you told the story and the components of the story were very nice. Like they were excellent, stellar.
Right.
Yeah, I would honestly ask. Question is, who's your audience, and then like how can you take this spot on storytelling that you did in this presentation and move it to whatever audience you want to, because I really enjoyed this presentation, and I think other people would like to see it too. So thank you.
Thank you, John. Okay, let's hear from group 5.
Okay, I'm Todd Hilton. I'll say a few comments for group 5. First, there was fear that we didn't, among some of us, that we weren't expert enough in all of the different pieces of the problem to be confident enough to say something. That was one clear problem. Like it's complicated, and I don't feel that what I have to say is credible or worthy for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if we could help people get around that, and I think you made some good points that actually the problems are pretty simple. I mean, it's not actually that complicated why the world gets hotter. And so I think if we could feel more confident that we do know what's wrong, we would be more proactive. Now, the other part that came through was that several of us were quite emotional about the problem, upset. Upset not only because, we're afraid that bad things are happening, but upset because it feels hopeless, utterly hopeless. Not only for us as individuals, but for us as a group, because we have such a short time to make such a huge change. And I think that feeling of hopelessness, we got to get through the grief phase to the possibility phase as rapidly as possible, in order to get past that hopelessness, which just paralyzes us. It paralyzes me. And so that was another comment. I don't know how to do these things. I'm just telling you what my feelings were and what the group sort of expressed in various ways. And then lastly, if the foundational problems in getting us to move are really basic things about ourselves, our personalities, our psychology, things that I don't know much about, I suspect they are. We gotta figure out a way to get to the nut of it now, right? If we think about the world in an incorrect way on a large scale, we are toast. So we better figure out how to change people's mind in a hurry, which maybe is a design problem. I'll leave that up to the design experts on the call. So that's for group 5.
Great, thank you, Todd. And group 7, do we have a comment from you? Anybody from group 7? No. Okay, so let's move to group 2 then. Thought I heard somebody.
You had some nice people in group 2.
Group 2, going.
I don't know what group we were in.
That you should have remembered. Okay, I could say
can't help you with that.
I could say a few things about group 2. I was in group 2. We basically tried to explore our immediate situation right now. We had international groups. So someone was from Norway and tried to compare the reaction of America and Norway. And there was a sense that in the USA, there's a lot more use of social media. There's also a sensibility that maybe COVID-19 gives us some kind of example. We don't know if it's positive or negative of individual action versus collective action. Obviously, we're acting as individuals to stay safe, but we know it's a collective decision-making, but it's urgent. So there's an issue there. And then there is a sense that was expressed that there seems to be a much more willingness to engage for social activism, human rights or stuff like that, than for climate, because it's not visible in the same way and it's not accountable in the same way. So that's a problematic that you would like to address.
Great, thank you. Okay, group 4.
Group 4 was us, I think, and we had a different kind of discussion. But Nan, actually, do you want to talk about that a little bit? Do you want to bring up a few of those points, or someone else in group 4?
Sure, I'll start us off, and maybe Dina or Joshua will jump in. We talked about the design of the course and wondering if it would work for everyone, and would it work for a climate denier? And then we talked about different species of climate activists, that it's not a one-size-fit-all sort of approach. And might we create a menu of engagements to move people from beginner to expert activist or anywhere in between, answering the question, what can I do, what can we do? And to that point that you made, Deborah, about social movements feel more tangible and motivating and more visible, but how do we make the issues of climate justice visible? Because they're all around us. We just, and I think about the photograph of Emmett Till and how that catalyzed the civil rights movement. How do we make it visible? So maybe other folks from group 2 would like to say something. Or group 4, sorry.
Yeah, these are great. I wish we had a lot of time where we could discuss it really deeply after everyone says something. So keep these things in the back of your head. I want to get to, let's see, group 6 now. You have to pop up because we'll be gone. Nobody from group 6? Okay, group 8. Yeah.
Hi there.
Hi, Brianna.
So we thought that the outline makes a lot of sense and that we thought it would be a really great class to introduce. And we just kind of discussed like how we imagined it would be implemented. We thought that labs would be really helpful within each section that Adam brought up, so that to help facilitate action, and it's something that they can carry on with them, the students can carry on with them into life. And also we discussed individual action versus communicative, like community action and general action, and how because people might take this class because they're drawn to the subject, but how can these students take this class and teach others? And some people were saying that it could be if there's so much information to be covered, it could be a multi-part class. It could be like a kind of like the COGS 101 series, and within like broken up into 3 parts. And some people were saying we're arguing it could be like a general education requirement because it has so much merit to it. So yeah.
Thank you, Brianna. Mm-hmm. Okay, so group 9. So Stephanie, hello.
Hi, I didn't get much time before my members logged off to different classes, but I would say that the point that was made was we really liked this talk in particular because I feel when people generally approach climate change, it's more of an explanation of what is happening, but it was one of the first few times that we saw kind of steps towards progress, and I feel like that's what usually lacks. It's more of just we're stuck in this, let's assure the public, rather than reaching out to the people who are already willing to make changes. So seeing kind of that steps, and the person who previously mentioned the menu of options would be really interesting to kind of see if the public had access to that.
Okay, and I think group 10 is our last group. I'm not sure we had anybody in that.
Well,
go for it, Don.
Yeah. The name says Julie Norman because I couldn't figure out how to sign in, and my wife did though. So,
yeah.
So this is Don Norman. I thought Adam's major points were excellent. Giving a brief history, and then, but more importantly, trying to talk about how individuals could actually make a difference in the country with some historical examples. I thought there were other issues, though, that were weak. And so let me talk about a couple. There's a wonderful book called Why We Don't Believe in Climate Control. And it's really excellent because it looks at the different reasons that people are in denial or shrug their shoulders. And part of it, and a lot of it is emotional. So for example, there's one major cause that's often discussed, and that's that scientists don't explain their work very clearly. And the book basically says that's not it. There are lots of people who've heard these explanations and even listen and understand them and say, nah. So one of the issues is belief. How do you get people to change or understand their beliefs? And a real problem here is that it's so slow. And in fact, Nan pointed that out when she said, trying to make things that are visible. And the trouble is, if you take a look at the things that people haven't believed for quite a while, it's first of all that the coronavirus was serious, and that led to COVID-19. People just there wasn't any impact. People kept saying these horrible stories, but nobody saw anything. Cigarette smoking. You smoke a cigarette, you feel good, you don't feel bad. And so therefore the argument that the argument that you don't have any feedback. There's no, we are really tuned, the human body looks for causes and results. And we love to find causal explanations for almost everything, including things that don't have simple causal relationships. But the relationship has to be very fast. Lots of psychological studies showed you want a few seconds between the thing that causes and the thing that results, with mild exceptions. Like if I'm violently ill, then the cause is whatever last novel food I ate, even if it was days ago. But usually there has to be a pretty fast thing, and climate is not only very, very slow, but it has multiple feedback loops, and it's nonlinear, and it's very complex. The other issue is the economics, that for the history of capitalism has been growth. Growth, 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 and this has led to a huge emphasis in the money markets, and there's a whole system here that has caused people to grow, and that the companies have tremendous political power because they have money. And one of the things is the companies don't pay for what's called the externalities. If I manufacture something and produce a lot of toxic waste, so what? I dump it in the streams. I get rid of it. I don't have to pay for it. And if I put noxious gases into the atmosphere, well, I don't pay for it. But now we've reached the point where, okay, we are polluting the atmosphere. Look, China is a really good example, because China is polluting the atmosphere more than anybody else, but they're also doing more than anybody else to try to solve the problem. But they have this dilemma, is that you can't overnight switch to a neutral power source. It takes decades. And they have how many million people? 1 billion people. And so they have to live, and so they're burning coal, even though everybody knows it's horrible, because they don't know what the alternative is immediately. And it's these issues that we have to address. Now, how do we address it? Well, that's what Adam was talking about. So how does individuals come to address that? And we have to address it probably because the major tool that we have in front of us is us going on political strike, going on civil disobedience, collecting in mobs. It doesn't have to be against the law. It just has to be large enough numbers that causes disruption, that causes people to pay attention, but hopefully in positive ways, not in negative ways. So in our section, Jennifer asked, how do we help Aron improve his course? Because that's the question he asked. And unfortunately, I don't know, because this is such a complex issue. Every one of these issues is a series of courses all by itself. But so I conclude by saying that because Adam raised the issue so nicely, I mean, the very questions I asked and the very things I just talked about, I think is actually a tribute to the fact that he raised the issues in a really good way, which causes us to think deeply about what is going on.
Yeah. So Adam, I'm going to let you respond to what Dawn was talking about, or what any of the other speakers might have asked, and I'll also open it up to other people that might want to ask questions or make comments. So Adam?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you, everyone. I think this has been really great, actually, just giving people a chance to speak like this and have a bit more of a discussion. Let me see. And thank you for saying, quite gratifying things to hear that it goes down well. I think, I guess it's Todd. Todd was saying, to touch on a few of the things you said there, I thought were interesting, right? One was feeling like you're not an expert. I mean, maybe did you mean like, do you feel you're not like an expert, or that's the impediment people have? But whatever you meant, I think it's a good point. And I think that might have been one of the basis for people really not getting engaged for a long time. Oh, that's so complicated. It's complicated. We need the people at SIO to take care of this. I've got bad news for you. The people at SIO are not taking care of this. The people at SIO are putting error bars on the future over and over and over again. I mean, is it complicated? Sure, it's complicated in the sense of how fast is the Western Arctic ice shelf going to collapse, and will the sea go? But the basic thing is not complicated. It's been understood for a long time. The greenhouse gas effect is very straightforward to explain to people. And I think that, maybe in a way it is to empower people, like to say, look, there is the IPCC 2018 report approved by the world's governments calling for a 50% reduction by 2030. I mean, that's very straightforward. And the underlying mechanistic information you need to do to kind of understand that is simple. And then, is it complicated in the sense, this is our life, this is our planet, this is our children, this is our biosphere, it concerns all of us. And so maybe, do we need to be experts? Why do we need to be experts? We need to, I think what people need to do, I think what's important maybe with a class like this and this kind of discussion we're having is people need to get empowered. Actually, here we go, here's an answer. You know, I was worried about this for years. I was involved in the fossil fuel divestment thing at UCSD with Eric Hallgren from 2016. It started in 2012. 2016, I was involved. I wanted to do something about climate change. But I didn't really know very much about it. I just had a sense that this was a problem I wanted to help with. It's only really when I sat down and started mapping out this class, which was really about a year ago, and I kind of empowered myself a little bit to grab the knowledge, information, read a little bit the IPCC reports, look at this now. I was like, oh my God, right? And so there comes a point with studying it, with being steeped in it to some extent, where people can take some ownership over some core facts, then to kind of be empowered enough to feel like, no, I do have enough expertise. I have enough expertise to comment on and act on the fact that my planet is going down the drains. And this kind of notion that there's some elusive experts I need to kind of help me get that, I think we need to get people over that hump. Your feeling of it being hopeless, you know, yes, I think Nan wrote a remark upon, you know, on that in the chat. I think that, you know, if one doesn't grieve, if one doesn't sob, if one isn't shattered about it, then one hasn't really looked at it. So that, you know, and there are lots of people who haven't really looked at it actually. You know, Wallace Wells's work, Uninhabitable Earth, really jogged a few liberal types out of their stasis, and they were like, oh my God, because he dramatizes it. Mm-hmm. I think that feeling of hopelessness and grief is okay. And Nan wrote, you know, you have to kind of sit with it and you're going to get through that. It's okay to feel like that. In fact, one should feel like that. That's a sign that, you know, you just don't want to be stuck in the hopelessness. And then I personally feel, you know, it's not hopeless. And the notion that, you know, that it's too late is bullshit. There's no such thing as too late. Every half a degree we stave off is massive. You know, it may be too late to stop it at 1.5, but it's not too late to stop it at 2 and 2.5 and 2. You know, these are enormous differences of hundreds of millions of people. And, you know, a very hopeful thing I'll tell you all is that, you know, and some of you know this, Nan knows this, I think, is that, you know, when I'm part of the climate movement, and particularly, and I don't want to do this thing of saying the young people have to, we all have to do it, but young people, of course, make one feel better in general, is that, you know, the solution to our problem isn't very complicated, Don, it's not very complicated, and it is that we have to envision a somewhat different world. And what that world is actually a very nice world. I mean, it's not a world where you jump on a plane and go to Bali for the weekend to do yoga, okay? But it's a world where we take care of each other and we take care of our local biosphere and we have solidarity and we have democracy and we have local foods. We don't have kiwi fruits coming from New Zealand on jet planes anymore. We don't need them, you know? And so the climate movement has these features. It has, you know, huge solidarity. People are taking care of each other. People are checking in with each other. People are working for free all the time because they're planet protectors. It works with democratic structures. It's non-consumerist. You know, it instantiates some of the core ingredients of what a better world looks like. And I find that very, very hopeful and very kind of, it's enjoyable in a way, right? The hopefulness part, I think, is that, you know, there is going to probably come some time, Todd and others. I mean, I think, you know, if we get towards the end of this decade and we haven't got serious large-scale move away from fossil fuels, if UCSD is still using Bank of America in 7 years, okay, if the UC system is generating 2 million tons of CO2, if UCSD still has a cogeneration plant with 200,000 tons of CO2 going up in smoke from natural gas in 2027, then we know we're done for. Then we can be really hopeless. Then we'll feel like, well, now we're getting to the point where we've really wasted this decade and now we're on track for 2 degrees. But we don't, we have 10 years, you know, or whatever. I mean, there's nothing magical. You know what I'm saying? And I think it's worth being hopeful about that. I mean, I think it's worth recognizing that, you know, the climate strikes of Greta and the young people, and not just the young people, and the Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion shut down London, you know, for 2 weeks. They completely shut down the UK to the point where the whole system oriented towards, unfortunately now, they got caught up in Brexit and the pandemic, but they managed to totally change the conversation and totally raise consciousness. It's happening, and it's happening in concert. There is a real climate movement around the world. It's penetrated through the veil of distortion. The CNN calls it the climate crisis now. We reached a point in 2018, 2019, where we reached a sort of tipping point. It broke through the denial. So I think we should be hopeful that, as we get involved more in collective action, the climate movement has very good features in it that are worth believing in. We can turn this thing around. I think we have to do that, and anyway, so that's the point, comment on that. To Don's point, well, let's see, the human rights, the point that I can't remember who made, Deborah made for her group about how in Scandinavia or somewhere else, there was sort of more engagement in human rights action and perhaps less in climate. And then Nan's point about the linkage. This is so important, right? This is something the climate movement, the environmental movement has generally struggled with. I'm no historian and I don't know much about this, but I take it on good authority that if you look at the environmental movement in the United States, going back to Rachel Carson, it's basically a bunch of middle-class white people, right? It never really made contact with anyone else. Now we look at the climate movement now, it has to some extent similar problems. If you look at Extinction Rebellion, it's mostly middle-class and retired white people in the UK. And you look at the Sunrise Movement, it's mostly middle-class college students. So there really needs to be, this is a very significant thing, there needs to be alliances made with social justice, for example, Black Lives Matter, all the myriad concerns in the United States. And theoretically, that is a complete no-brainer, right? The problems that ail 2 million incarcerated people in the United States, the problems that ail Black African Americans with the police violence, people who live in the shadow of oil refineries, people that are marginalized, disenfranchised, it's very much connected with the underlying pathologies that gave us the climate crisis. It ought to be possible to form a sort of wall of solidarity, but it's not easy to do that in practice for reasons I don't fully understand. I think people are, if you're in Black Lives Matter and you're concerned about police violence, you might have a similar underlying diagnosis about the sort of, a imperialistic corporatist control, which is what also gave us the climate crisis, but that's a kind of theoretical analysis. How to do that in practice is a really big challenge. I think it's an interesting topic for study. It's not just an activist thing. And then what else did I want to say? Comment on the grief part. I think a student or someone, I don't see him here right now. I mean, just, I think, okay. What else? Don's points about, I think, Don, some of the criticism you were making, I took it as, that's fine. I do think I sort of hit some of that. I think fundamentally there is a problem underlying all this, which is the logic of endless economic growth. And that is sort of implicit somehow in my design, certainly the Naomi Klein's analysis. The belief thing is hugely important, you're totally right. And I have some of that in there, but not enough or more. It could be a lot more. There's a huge domain of sort of judgment, decision-making, Kahneman's first key system 1, system 2, temporal discounting, threat perception, issues of human decision-making and nudges and actually, the really important thing about the visceral, right? I think I did touch on that a little bit, but I didn't expand on it much. It is a threat issue. It is a visceral thing. It is, but by the way, this is very complicated. So people that have experienced extreme weather events, like in ostensibly Paradise and in the Gulf and the hurricanes, you can actually track Twitter feeds. You can kind of sample from social media and you can see a huge uptick of like mentions of climate change. But does that translate into belief change? And does it endure? And what does that take? We don't know. This is very, very poorly understood and poorly explored. The sense we have, the sense I have is that, with some of the friends and colleagues is you kind of want to take people and just jolt them out of it. You want to say, for God's sake, look at this. Pay attention. And then they're like, oh God, it's so horrible. It's going to make me very depressed. That's what my friend told me. I can't afford to get too depressed, Adam. I think, what a strange comment is that? What is he saying when he's saying I can't afford to get too depressed? He's like, I worry that if I would look at this more closely, it would overwhelm me. And what are you worried about? It's interesting, there's a whole kind of walls of, it's not just the right-wing nutcase, the climate denialist that's enthralled to sort of the logic of the free market. I think most of our friends and colleagues are in a kind of denial. It's just of a different flavor. And, how do you move people? How do you budge them? And I don't know the answers. I think a secret recipe is you simultaneously jolt people with factual, dramatic and even science fiction in the near future demonstrations of look where we're headed, look what JP Morgan is saying, look what the data say, look what happened in Australia, and shock them and make it visceral. At the same time, you have to kind of, almost in the same moment, you have to make them feel hopeful. And, you know, and how to make them feel hopeful is complicated, because in a way, hopefulness comes from a recognition of the power of collective action, which many people, you know, by the way, as an aside, and this is important, it's not an accident that we live in an era, particularly in Anglo countries, particularly the UK and here in Australia, right, that we have the most deadened political consciousness. There is very little sense of solidarity because we live, people, you know, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think a bunch of Koch brothers in a mahogany room made it happen like this. But, you know, the logic of, you know, Homo economicus is he or she goes to Home Depot to get a new refrigerator on the weekend and buys more stuff. You want people to be isolated and fragmented and constantly purchasing. That's what spins this wheel. When people really do solidarity, they don't need to go and shop in Home Depot for a refrigerator because they're busy like sharing food with their neighbors and taking care of each other and maybe sharing the, you know, the washing machine. So there's been a huge, you know, atomization and fragmentation of people. And that's, you know, not unrelated to the predicament. And so I think hopefulness comes from saying, kind of like I tried to articulate a little earlier, you know, there's a positive vision of this. But it's very hard in a single conversation or in a particular setting to take someone and say, for God's sake, wake up, this is really serious stuff. And at the same time to kind of make them see this positive vision, because that positive vision is, you know, it requires certain veils being taken off about the structure of the society around you. So it's hard. I mean, and I think, you know, I don't think Hollywood will do this, partly because Hollywood instantiates some of the standard values, but very good TV shows, very powerful movies, very, you know, there's got to be cultural modes that can kind of, you know, be good like this. Anyway, those are some of the things that pop to mind. And, you know, I'll stop talking now.
Adam, I think Don would like to make a comment.
Yeah, I'll sort of take advantage of the fact that technically I'm teaching this class, although as you see, I'm not co-leading this. And besides, I'm the oldest person in the room. You know, Adam, I don't think that we disagree. In fact, I wasn't trying to disagree with you. I was trying to say that I thought that a lot of the issues are more complex than you were able to talk about in your short talk. And you kind of said that in this last response. And many of the issues that I said really have to be treated more deeply. You also had said so. But in the last talk, I was amused by two different things you said. I hope you'll find it amusing too. One is you said, look, the issues are really pretty simple. But later on you said, but I don't know how to make it happen. And there's an old saying that says, what's the difference between theory and practice? And the answer is, well, in theory, there is no difference. In practice, it's huge. And that you mentioned, for example, Danny and Amos, or you actually called it Kahneman, and you left out Tversky, unfortunately. They're psychologists. They're good friends of mine, or I should say they were. Amos died. They did point out how people fail in their own reasoning, but you know what? They themselves continued to fail in the very same ways that they had written their articles about, saying how people made these errors all the time. And in their private lives, they kept making the very same errors themselves, even though intellectually they were the world's experts on knowing that this was the wrong decision, the wrong way to behave. Mm-hmm. And they had many discussions with many people themselves, and actually with me a few times, about why on earth was this happening. And you also mentioned the book Nudge by Rich Thaler, he's a behavioral economist. The same issues. He's talking about trying to subconsciously cause people to change their behavior for the good through nudges. And he actually, by the way, he called this a design problem. When he wrote the book, he came to me and said that he was writing a book on design and could I comment on it? And a lot of the issues you talk about are design issues when you think about design as a way of thinking, the way of addressing these complex issues. They are very, very hard. I noticed in the chat, somebody recommended the book by Octavia Butler called Parable of the Sower. And that's a science fiction book. And you know the people who have thought a lot about this most? Oh, it was Nan who recommended it. The people who have thought about this most are the science fiction writers. Why? Because if you're writing science fiction, and a good person to look at is Kim, just lost his name. He's a UCSD.
Stanley Robinson.
Kim Stanley Robinson, a UCSD graduate, by the way, who's written really good books on the impact of climate. And because if you're writing a novel, you have to not only talk about the scientific issues, but you have to show what its impact is on people's lives. And in his case, he showed why people failed to take attention to the climate change until basically it was too late. And therefore, most of the book is not how they prevented it, but how they adapted to it. And it's a really hard problem. And, you know, I think I'd enjoy teaching the course with you.
You're welcome. I mean, just a quick clarification, and also want to hear from some people who are still here, haven't spoken. Hopefully you're going to raise some stuff.
Yeah.
Just a quick clarification. I think, you know, the class that I kind of presented to you, I think is my answer to how to communicate this. I think it's like in this 10-week thing which takes through all of that. I think people come through that, and as Nan knows, some of them became climate activists, right? Is then it is kind of this arch of the grief and the facts and the grief and the pain, and then kind of this hopefulness and the connection with social movements. What I meant, though, that I don't know how to do is how to do that quickly. You know, I mean, you know, you don't have your friends in San Diego and get them to put them through a 10-week course. You have a few conversations with people.
So I think that it's interesting to consider as a psychologist, when you on one side you have the thinking under uncertainty and why it's hard to make decisions. But there's also more now about the real effects of the positive effects of compassion thinking and compassion meditation. And it actually makes you feel good. It improves your immune system. Taking care of each other really, really makes you feel good. So how can you start giving people that experience in smaller doses and more immediate doses so that can improve?
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, just a
quick comment on that. I mean, you know, in some ways, and I don't want to say inaccurate or misguided things here, but it seems to me anyway, having lived here for, you know, more than a decade or whatever, I mean, look, there's no mystery. And people want to go back to the normal after the pandemic. What is the normal in the United States? 2 million people in prison, 60,000 a year opioid epidemics, 60,000 a year gunshots. I mean, this is not a very happy situation. Three guys have as much wealth as 50% of the people. The top 1% have as much wealth as the bottom 90%. It's not very good, okay? And part of what ails it is feelings of, my wife's a psychiatrist, so she can comment on this. I mean, colossal levels of alienation and loneliness and misery and being stuck at home. I mean, I feel like that, not even under the pandemic. I mean, a lot of the time I feel that. I feel that I'm in the climate movement. You know, you get to the weekends, you've got your young children, it's like, where the fuck is everybody? You know, you're suburbanized, you're fragmented, you're alone. It's horrible, right? And it saps your soul. And I think, you know, in some ways, there is something very hopeful here, right? Is that getting out, no, of course, not everyone feels like that, and some people have a wonderful setup, but getting out of that in some ways is connected with ridding ourselves of the carbon ideologies. I mean, that mode of living is the carbon ideology, right? It's premised on endless supplies of cheap energy that have to keep refostering and creating more demand. As you move out of the carbon ideology, you also leave behind the social pathology. And I think, you know, to your point, Deborah, I mean, that's kind of a subtle thing, but there must be a way, and this is a jiu-jitsu maneuver. It's not going to work for your sort of standard, you know, Trump-loving, MAGA hat-wearing person in the Central Valley necessarily, but you could imagine there are modes of sort of helping people eventually get along to understanding that there are ways to just feel a lot better, And you touched on it with the compassion. There's ways to
But you
just
know-
feel a lot happier and better
Yeah.
when you leave behind the carbon ideologies. Yeah.
There's even one more nuance, and Nan Renner and I have had several conversations about that, that compassion is different from empathy. And a lot of the grief comes from this kind of empathy and identification with stuff. What compassion allows you to do is to focus more on the actions that you could take for someone else's behalf or on your behalf. And I think that kind of fits your connection between individual and collective action. So if there is a way to get that nuance across, and we now have actually some of the neuroscience to support that, that could make a difference. Some really interesting on people who do compassion meditation versus when they actually identify with suffering and the difference in actually brain and effect on immune and stuff like that.
I just have a slight allergy when we talk about our climate predicament to the sort of, don't take my comments in the wrong way, people, but this kind of like, I'm going to be meditating and it's all about me. I'm good. You know, I figured out how to, fuck that, man. Like we need people to, I mean, you want people to feel good and if meditation is going to help you be good, but you need to be good with other people. And
But
you need to help take care of other people, and maybe you have to
absolutely.
start with yourself, right?
Yeah, and this mode of compassion is really driven to action. But, yeah.
I'm going to let Olu.
Yeah.
Olu has been very patient with her hand up, so I'm going to let her go ahead and ask a question.
Hi.
Olu, go ahead.
My name is Fisayo.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I really appreciated the talk. I think what I found like the most, I don't know what the right word is, but the most uncomfortable to like agree with and like understand completely was the like relating the climate change movements to social rights movements. And then I really appreciated how you later on talked about how you can't talk about climate change without talking about capitalism, and you can't talk about capitalism without talking about marginalized groups, and how climate change is like partly a result of the exploitation of these groups. So my question is like for the class, how is that going to be addressed? And I don't know, just how can the conversation about climate change be more inclusive? Because on a personal level, like I do believe climate change is real and I do believe that it should be addressed, but I also find more issues more important, like issues relating to social justice and these marginalized groups. So yeah, just how could it be more inclusive and how it can be addressed in a more inclusive manner?
Those are really deep questions, and I'm going to say that I don't have a lot of answers there. I mean, I sort of alluded to that is a very important thing you're talking about there earlier, that is a point that needs to be explored and understood and worked. You know, this is one of the domains where I have a lot more reading to do. I think this touches on, environmental racism, it touches on social justice, it touches on the intersectionality, to use that, long and painful word. I've noticed that Naomi Klein was in a dialogue with Kenyatta Taylor at Princeton, who's one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter, sort of theoretically and intellectually. You start to see in the climate movement points of contact, but it does look to me mostly like theory and people talking. How do you get to the practice? How do you get to the action? In some ways, there are places where it's very visible. When you look at the indigenous Americans in South Dakota, North Dakota, with the Keystone XL, right? The big protest that occurred in the last term of Obama, that was a very nice example of real solidarity, where the climate movement, people from the coasts, college students from Massachusetts, others went and stood against police water cannon. I mean, it doesn't always have to be so dramatic, but there they were with Native American Indians protecting their lands against the pipeline. Now that's a point where the climate movement is like, no, we cannot keep extracting those tar sands. We cannot build this pipeline. It's ruining our planet. And there's a very natural point where they can now come together against people who are trying to protect their land from environmental depredation. There are a few examples like that that are really great ones, but it's not broad enough. It's not big enough. And
Yeah.
I'm afraid I don't really have answers for you. It's something I don't know that much about, and I want to learn more about it. It's yeah.
Yeah, and even going off of that, like a lot of indigenous people have already been practicing like sustainable practices, right? So it's like how, yeah, it's very complex. I don't know, just a conversation about being more sustainable. How can it be more applicable to indigenous groups that have been practicing that for years, but then, you know, industrialism, like capitalism kind of is infringing on that in so many different ways.
Did you guys see the film Avatar, when James Cameron's film? You remember Avatar? You know, I was just thinking about this as you're speaking now. I mean, so it's sort of amazing in the sense that it was really finally a 3D movie that actually worked as a 3D movie, right? And it was kind of like a bit of a hokey story, but at the essence, it has something really good, which is that we developed this huge sympathy for those, that is indigenous people living in the forest, and then this kind of massive extractivism came and started cutting the trees down. Everyone who watches that movie would kind of sympathize with the indigenous. It's just, you know, it's kind of, you want to redo that movie, but you want to make it much more concrete and much more real. And that extractivist logic is not like the US military or some kind of company. It's actually the system that we're all part of. And I was just thinking as you're talking, you know, but anyway,